The autumn morning air carried a crispness that seemed to mirror the tension in my chest as I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse. My heart hammered against my ribs with each step on the marble floor, the sound of my sensible shoes echoing in the vast hallway like a countdown to Judgment Day. I had dressed carefully that morning, my best black suit, the one I'd worn to my husband's funeral 2 years prior, and the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. If this was to be my final stand, I would face it with whatever dignity I had left. My daughter Dawn sat rigidly beside her husband on the opposite side of the courtroom, her pregnant belly visible beneath her navy dress. The sight of her, my own flesh and blood, the child I had rocked to sleep through countless nights, the little girl who once declared I was her hero, sitting there like a stranger, nearly broke my resolve. When our eyes met briefly, she quickly looked away, her jaw set in that stubborn line she'd inherited from me. Dave, her husband, leaned back in his chair with the smug confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. His perfectly pressed suit and expensive haircut spoke of someone who had never known real struggle, never had to choose between buying groceries and paying the electric bill. But then something extraordinary happened. Judge Morales looked up from the paperwork spread before him, and his entire demeanor changed. His eyes widened, his pen slipped from his fingers, and he leaned forward as if he'd seen a ghost. The words that fell from his lips in barely a whisper would change everything. It's her. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Every head turned toward me, confusion written across their faces. None of them, not Dawn, not Dave, not even their expensive lawyer, had any idea what was about to unfold. They thought they knew who I was, Maeve Williams, 69 years old, a simple grandmother living on a modest pension, someone to be pitied, dismissed, or in their case, discarded. How wrong they were. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the woman I was before that life-altering morning in court. My name is Maeve Williams, and for 67 years of my life, I lived quietly in the shadows of other people's expectations. Each day began the same way. At 6 a.m, I would shuffle to my small kitchen in my worn slippers, the floorboards creaking their familiar greeting beneath my feet. The coffee maker, a wedding gift that had somehow survived 3 decades of daily use, would gurgle to life as I filled my chipped ceramic mug, the one with the faded roses that my husband had bought me at a garage sale when we were newlyweds and couldn't afford much of anything. Standing at the kitchen window, I would tend to my African violets, their purple faces turned toward whatever weak sunlight managed to filter through the glass. These flowers had been my husband's pride and joy, and caring for them each morning felt like keeping a piece of him alive. The ritual brought me comfort in those first lonely months after his passing, when the house felt too big and too quiet, when I would catch myself setting 2 plates for dinner out of habit. My life had been built around sacrifice, not the dramatic, movie-worthy kind, but the quiet, daily surrendering of dreams that most mothers know intimately. For 45 years, I was the woman who worked nights cleaning office buildings while my daughter slept, coming home with aching knees and chemical-burned hands, only to rise again at dawn to pack her lunch and walk her to school. I was the woman who sold homemade cupcakes at school bake sales, who mended clothes by lamplight to save money for Dawn's college fund, who took on extra sewing jobs when the bills piled higher than my modest salary could cover. When Dawn married Dave 5 years ago, I welcomed him with open arms and an open heart, despite the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach whenever I watched him with my daughter. There was something in the way he looked at her, not with love, but with ownership. Something in the way he spoke over her during family dinners, dismissing her opinions with a patronizing smile. But I held my tongue, believing that my job as a mother was to support my daughter's choices, even when those choices made my heart ache. After my husband's death, I had foolishly believed that Dawn and I would grow closer. I imagined quiet evenings spent looking through photo albums, sharing memories of the man we both loved. I pictured her bringing her future children to visit their grandmother, filling my empty house with laughter again. Instead, the opposite happened. My daughter began to slip away from me like sand through my fingers, her visits becoming shorter, her phone calls less frequent, her excuses more elaborate. What I didn't understand then, what I couldn't see through my grief and loneliness, was that Dave was orchestrating my isolation with the precision of a master manipulator. Every suggestion that I was becoming forgetful, every comment about my age and decline, every gentle push toward the idea that I needed professional care was part of a carefully constructed plan. He was rewriting the story of who I was, turning me from Dawn's beloved mother into a burden to be managed. The humiliation began slowly, so gradually that I almost didn't notice the shift. Dawn's Sunday visits, once the highlight of my week, became tense affairs where she seemed constantly distracted, checking her phone and glancing at the clock as if she couldn't wait to leave. The easy conversations we'd once shared about books we were reading, neighbors we'd encountered, memories of her father were replaced by stilted inquiries about my health and pointed questions about whether I was managing okay on my own. Dave's behavior grew bolder with each visit. He would walk into my house without knocking, help himself to food from my refrigerator, and settle into my late husband's recliner as if it belonged to him. When I gently suggested he might be more comfortable on the sofa, he would give me that condescending smile and say something like, "Now, Mrs. Maeve, this old chair needs someone to break it in properly." His casual disrespect cut deeper each time, but Dawn either didn't notice or chose not to see it. The breaking point came on a gray Thursday in October, a day that had started with such hope. I had spent the morning preparing Dawn's favorite meal, chicken and dumplings made from scratch, the way my own mother had taught me. The recipe required hours of work, rolling the dough by hand, simmering the chicken until it fell off the bone, seasoning the broth with the perfect blend of herbs. It was comfort food in the truest sense, the kind of meal that spoke of love and tradition and the unbreakable bonds between mothers and daughters. I had set my dining room table with care, using the good china we usually saved for holidays and the embroidered tablecloth I had stitched during Dawn's teenage years. Fresh flowers from my garden served as the centerpiece, the last roses of the season, their petals soft and fragrant. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. When they arrived, Dave pushed through my front door without so much as a greeting, his eyes already scanning the room with an appraiser's calculation. He slumped into my husband's chair, grabbed the television remote, and began channel surfing as if he were in his own living room. Dawn followed behind him, beautiful in a green dress I had bought her for her birthday, but her expression was colder than I had ever seen it. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, and something in her tone made my blood run cold. This wasn't the voice of my daughter. This was the voice of a stranger, clinical and distant. She perched on the edge of the sofa as if she might bolt at any moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Dave and I have made a decision," she continued, the words falling from her lips like stones into still water. "This house is too big for you now. You can't maintain it alone anymore, and frankly, we're worried about your safety. We've found a wonderful retirement community where you'll have people your own age to socialize with, and there's medical care available around the clock." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. This house, our house, held every memory that mattered to me. It was where Dawn had taken her first steps, where she had blown out birthday candles, where her father had taught her to ride a bicycle in the driveway. It was where I had nursed her through childhood illnesses, helped her with homework at the kitchen table, and dried her tears after her first heartbreak. Every corner held a story. Every photograph on the walls was a testament to the life we had built together. "But Dawn," I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper, "this is our home. All our memories are here, your father's workshop in the basement, the height marks on the doorframe where we measured you growing up, the garden where you helped me plant vegetables every spring." Her response was like a physical blow. "Memories are in the heart, Mom, not in walls and rooms. Besides, you'll be much better off at the community. You'll have company, activities, proper meals. It's really the best thing for everyone." Dave looked up from the television then, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he began mentally dividing up my living space. It's for the best, Mrs. Maeve, he said with that false concern I had grown to despise. We'll handle all the paperwork. You won't have to worry about a thing. And don't you think it's time Dawn and I had a proper place to start our family? The cruelty of it took my breath away. My own daughter, the child for whom I had sacrificed my youth, my health, my dreams, was throwing me out of my own home to make room for the man who had poisoned her heart against me. I felt tears threatening, but I swallowed them back. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I need time to think about this, I managed to say, clinging to whatever dignity I had left. There's really nothing to think about, Mom, Dawn replied, already standing to leave. We've already contacted the real estate agent. The house will be appraised next week. And with that, they were gone. They left my carefully prepared meal untouched, my flowers wilting in their vase, and my heart shattered on the table where we had once been a family. I sat alone in the silence they had left behind, staring at the empty chairs and wondering how the little girl who once told me I was her hero had become someone I no longer recognized. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of despair and disbelief. I wandered through my house like a ghost, touching familiar objects as if I could absorb their comfort through my fingertips. The rocking chair where I had nursed Dawn through sleepless nights, the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals, the bedroom where my husband had taken his last breath. How could I leave all of this behind? Dave returned the next day with a real estate appraiser, a thin man in an expensive suit who walked through my home as if it were already his to evaluate. He made notes on a clipboard, measured rooms, and discussed necessary improvements in a voice loud enough for me to hear every disparaging comment. The hardwood floors my husband had refinished by hand were dated. The kitchen cabinets he had built from scratch were outdated. The bathroom tiles we had chosen together during happier times were in need of complete renovation. Dawn followed the appraiser through each room, nodding at his suggestions as if she couldn't wait to erase every trace of the life her father and I had built. When he pointed out that the electrical system would need updating, she agreed enthusiastically. When he mentioned that the plumbing was original to the house, she made a note on her phone. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen, invisible and irrelevant, watching my daughter plan the destruction of everything I held dear. The final humiliation came when Dawn returned later that week with glossy brochures for Sunset Manor, the retirement community they had chosen for me. She spread them across my coffee table like travel magazines, her voice artificially bright as she pointed out the amenities. Look, Mom, they have a library and crafts classes every Tuesday. There's bingo on Thursday nights, and they serve 3 meals a day in the dining room. You won't have to cook or clean anymore. Isn't that wonderful? I stared at the photographs of elderly people sitting in circles, painting ceramics and playing cards, and felt my soul shrivel. These weren't activities, they were ways to pass time until death. This wasn't living, it was waiting to die with other people who had been similarly discarded by their families. And there's medical care available 24 hours a day, Dawn continued, reading from the brochure. They have nurses on staff and a doctor comes twice a week. You'll be so much safer there. Safer, the word stuck in my throat like a bone. I had lived in this house for 30 years without incident. I knew every neighbor on the street, every crack in the sidewalk, every shortcut to the grocery store. But to Dawn, none of that mattered. What mattered was getting me out of the way so she and Dave could start their new life in the home I had shared with her father. The end came swiftly and brutally. On a rainy Wednesday morning, they arrived with papers and a lawyer, a sharp-faced woman who introduced herself as Ms. Patterson and spoke to me as if I were a child. Dave strode into my living room like he already owned it, followed by Dawn, who couldn't meet my eyes. Mrs. Williams, the lawyer began, spreading documents across my coffee table. We have all the necessary paperwork here for the property transfer. We just need your signature in a few places, and we can move forward with the sale. Transfer? I asked, confused. I thought you were going to sell the house. Dawn finally looked at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I had never seen before, guilt mixed with greed. Well, Dave and I decided it would be better to keep the house in the family, for investment purposes. The truth hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about my safety or well-being. This wasn't even about selling the house to fund my care at the retirement community. This was theft, pure and simple. They wanted to take ownership of my home, the home my husband and I had spent decades paying for, the home where we had raised our daughter and built our life together. "I'm not signing anything," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. Dave's mask slipped then, revealing the cruel man I had always suspected lurked beneath his polite facade. "Mrs. Maeve, you're not thinking clearly. Dawn is your legal heir, and she's acting in your best interests." "This is my house," I said louder this time, "and I'm not leaving." "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be," Dawn pleaded, but I could hear the insincerity in her voice. "You know you can't keep living here alone. Last week you forgot to turn off the stove. What if there had been a fire?" It was a lie. I had never forgotten to turn off the stove, never left a burner on or a pot unattended. But Dave smiled as if she had just provided the perfect ammunition for their case. "Your mother isn't well, Dawn," he said with mock concern. "It's dangerous to leave her here alone. She could hurt herself or worse." The lawyer cleared her throat. "Mrs. Williams, if you're unwilling to sign voluntarily, we may need to explore other legal options. A competency hearing, for instance, to determine whether you're capable of making these decisions on your own." The words hit me like ice water. My own daughter was willing to have me declared mentally incompetent to steal my house. The man I had welcomed into my family was threatening me in my own living room, and I, a 69-year-old widow, was completely alone against all of them. "I need time," I whispered, defeated. "You have until Friday," Dave said coldly. "After that, we'll do what we have to do." When they left, I collapsed into my husband's chair and wept as I hadn't since his funeral. I cried for the daughter I had lost, for the home they were stealing, for the life that was crumbling around me like a house built on sand. I felt betrayed, humiliated, completely powerless against forces I couldn't control. That night, lying alone in the bed I had shared with my husband for 37 years, I seriously considered giving up. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was too old, too weak, too confused to fight back. Maybe it would be easier to sign their papers, pack my memories into boxes, and disappear quietly into the sterile world of Sunset Manor. But something deep inside me refused to surrender. A small flame of dignity still burned in my chest, fed by 45 years of hard work and sacrifice, by the memory of my husband's love, by the knowledge that what they were doing was wrong. I might be old, but I wasn't dead. I might be alone, but I wasn't helpless. And I would be damned if I was going to let them destroy me without a fight. The morning after their ultimatum, I woke with a strange sense of purpose. If I was going to lose everything, I wanted to spend my remaining days surrounded by the memories that mattered most. I decided to go through my husband's belongings, the boxes and files I had been too heartbroken to touch since his death. His desk in the basement had always been his private domain. During our marriage, I had respected his need for space to handle our finances and keep his personal papers organized. Now, with trembling hands, I began to sort through decades of documents, photographs, and mementos that told the story of our life together. Most of what I found was exactly what I expected: old tax returns, insurance policies, receipts for home repairs that brought back memories of weekend projects we had tackled together. But in the bottom drawer, pushed far back behind folders of household bills, I discovered something that stopped my heart: a locked metal box I had never seen before. The key was hidden inside my husband's favorite book, marking a page about investments and financial planning. When I opened the box, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock, I found documents that revealed a secret my husband had kept for our entire marriage. The first paper I unfolded was a will dated just 6 months before his death, a will I had never seen, despite being present when we had supposedly drafted our final documents together. As I read, the floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. My humble, hardworking husband had been far more clever than I had ever imagined. For decades, unbeknownst to me, he had been quietly investing every spare dollar we earned. When property values were low in the 1980s, he had purchased small rental houses. When the stock market dipped, he had bought shares in solid companies. When other families were spending their extra income on luxuries, he had been building a fortune that would ensure I never wanted for anything. But that was just the beginning. The will clearly stated that I was the sole beneficiary of everything, not just our house, but an entire portfolio of properties, stocks, and investments worth more money than I had ever dreamed possible. Dawn was mentioned, but only as a secondary beneficiary who would inherit a small sum if she cared for me with love and respect during my final years. My husband had been more perceptive than I had realized. Somehow, he had seen through Dave's charm to the greedy heart beneath. The will included specific language protecting me from exactly the kind of manipulation I was now facing. As I continued reading, each revelation was more stunning than the last. My husband owned the entire building where Dawn and Dave lived. The rent they had been paying for 3 years had been going directly into an account in my name, money I had never known existed. The man who was trying to throw me out of my home was actually living in my property, supporting my retirement fund with his monthly payments. There were more surprises. My husband held significant shares in the company where Dave worked, enough to influence employment decisions. He owned properties throughout the city, had investments in restaurants and small businesses, and held shares in mutual funds that had grown exponentially over the years. The bank statements showed an amount that made me dizzy. For 2 years since my husband's death, I had been living on a modest pension while millions of dollars accumulated in accounts I didn't know I owned. I had been pinching pennies and wearing the same clothes for years while I was, technically, a wealthy woman. But the most precious discovery was a personal letter in my husband's handwriting, sealed in an envelope marked for my beloved Maeve. "My dearest wife," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you, and you've found the treasure I've been saving for your golden years. Forgive me for keeping this sacred, but I wanted to surprise you with security and comfort when you needed it most." Tears streamed down my face as I continued reading. "You worked so hard for our family, sacrificed so much for Dawn's education and future. You deserve to spend your remaining years in luxury, not worry. But I must confess something that troubles me. I never completely trusted Dave. There's something about his ambition that concerns me, a coldness in how he looks at you and Dawn that makes me uneasy." My husband had seen what I had been too loving to acknowledge. Dave's true nature hadn't been hidden from everyone, just from the 2 women who loved him despite his flaws. "That's why I structured everything this way," the letter continued. "If Dawn treats you with the love and respect you deserve, she'll inherit enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But if she ever tries to take advantage of you or cast you aside, you have the power to protect yourself." The final paragraph broke my heart and filled it with hope simultaneously. "Use this power wisely, my love, not for revenge, but for protection and education. Deep down, Dawn is a good person, she's just lost her way. But if anyone tries to hurt you or take what's rightfully yours, you now have the strength to defend yourself. All my love, forever and always." I sat on the basement floor, surrounded by documents worth millions, crying for the wise man I had lost and the daughter I was about to save from her own terrible mistake. For the first time in months, my tears weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of gratitude, hope, and yes, a kind of quiet justice. Dawn and Dave thought they were stripping me of everything I owned. They had no idea they were living in my building, that Dave's paycheck came from a company I partially owned, that their entire life was built on my generosity. They thought they were throwing out a helpless old woman to claim her modest house, not knowing that this house was the least valuable thing in my portfolio. That night I didn't sleep, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't because of sadness or fear. My mind was working, planning, calculating. My husband had given me more than money, he had given me power, and now I had to decide how to use it. Not for revenge, as he had warned, but for the protection and education of the people I loved, even when they didn't deserve it. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that seems to highlight every detail of an important day. I dressed carefully in my best navy dress, the one I had worn to Dawn's wedding, and put on the pearl necklace my husband had given me for our 25th anniversary. If this was to be a battle, I would face it armored in dignity and the love of better days. Dawn and Dave arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, accompanied by their lawyer and a grim-faced man they introduced as a representative from Sunset Manor. They entered my living room like an invading army, carrying briefcases and folders and the absolute certainty that they had already won. "Good morning, Mom," Dawn said, avoiding my eyes as she kissed my cheek with lips that felt cold as winter. "We've brought all the paperwork to make this transition as smooth as possible." Dave settled into my husband's chair as if he already owned it, spreading documents across the coffee table with proprietary satisfaction. "Mrs. Maeve, we've arranged everything for your move to Sunset Manor. They're expecting you on Monday morning. Mr. Henderson here will help you pack whatever personal items you'd like to take." I looked at each of them, my daughter with her guilty, determined expression, her husband with his barely concealed triumph, the lawyer with her professional indifference, the Sunset Manor representative with his practiced sympathy. They were all so certain of their power, so confident in their plan. "I won't be signing anything," I said quietly, "and I won't be moving anywhere." Dave's smile faltered slightly. "Mrs. Maeve, we discussed this. You don't really have a choice in the matter anymore." "On the contrary," I replied, walking to the desk where I had placed a carefully selected portion of my husband's documents. "I think you'll find that I have more choices than any of us realized." I picked up the first document, the deed to their apartment building, and placed it on the coffee table next to their papers. "Did you know, Dave, that the building you've been living in for 3 years has never actually belonged to your landlord?" Dawn frowned, leaning forward to examine the document. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that your husband has been paying rent to me for 3 years without knowing it. This building, and 4 others like it, belong to me." The silence that followed was thunderous. Dave grabbed the deed, his face draining of color as he read my husband's name, then mine clearly listed as the legal owners. The lawyer leaned over his shoulder, her professional composure cracking as she verified the document's authenticity. This can't be right," Dave stammered. "You live on a pension, you drive a 20-year-old car, you shop with coupons." "I lived modestly because I chose to," I replied, enjoying their shock more than I probably should have. My husband was a very wise man who believed in investing for the future rather than spending for the present. I placed another document on the table, stock certificates, showing my ownership stake in Dave's company. "I also think you'll be interested to know that I own enough shares in Morrison and Associates to have significant influence over personnel decisions." Dave's face went from pale to gray. His hands shook as he read the certificate, calculating the implications for his career, his future, his carefully laid plans for my house. Dawn looked between the documents and my face, confusion and dawning realization warring in her expression. "Mom, if you had all this money, why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let me worry about your finances?" "Because I didn't know," I admitted. "Your father kept this secret to protect both of us, but more importantly, because he wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I had nothing left to offer." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Dawn's face crumpled as she understood the test she had failed, the character she had revealed when she thought there would be no consequences. The will specifically states, I continued, reading from my husband's document, that you would inherit a comfortable sum if you cared for me with love and respect during my final years. It also includes provisions for what should happen if you attempted to take advantage of me or treat me poorly. Dave stood up abruptly, packing to the window like a caged animal. This is impossible. If you had this kind of money, why would you live like a pauper? Because money doesn't define who I am, I replied. Unlike some people, I don't measure my worth by my bank account or judge others by what they can do for me. The lawyer cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with how quickly her client's position had deteriorated. Mrs. Williams, assuming these documents are authentic, this does change the legal landscape significantly. Oh, they're authentic, I assured her. You're welcome to verify them with any financial institution in the city. In fact, I encourage you to do so. Dawn collapsed onto the sofa as if her legs had been cut from under her. Mom, I don't understand. If you knew about all this, why did you let us believe you needed our help? I didn't know until 3 days ago, I repeated. But now that I do, I understand why your father structured things this way. He saw something in Dave that I was too trusting to recognize. Dave spun around from the window, his mask of civility finally slipping completely. This is blackmail. You're using money to manipulate us. Manipulation, the word came out sharper than I intended. Like when you manipulated Dawn into believing I was losing my memory. Like when you convinced her I was a danger to myself. Like when you threatened to have me declared incompetent. That was different, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're right, I agreed. It was different because your manipulation was based on lies, while my information is based on legal documents and bank statements. The Sunset Manor representative, who had been silently observing this family drama unfold, finally spoke up. Perhaps I should leave and let you folks work this out privately. That won't be necessary, I said firmly. Mr. Henderson, you can inform Sunset Manor that my living arrangements have changed. I won't be needing their services after all. As he packed up his materials and left, I turned back to my daughter and her husband. Dave had slumped back into the chair, his head in his hands, while Dawn stared at the documents scattered across the table as if they might rearrange themselves into a different reality. What happens now? Dawn asked in a small voice. Now, I said, we have an honest conversation about what kind of people we want to be going forward. Your father gave me the power to protect myself, but he also hoped I would use it to teach rather than punish. Dave looked up with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. So you're not going to evict us? That depends, I replied, on whether you're capable of learning from this experience. Over the following weeks, I watched Dave and Dawn struggle with the new reality of their situation. The balance of power in our relationship had shifted so dramatically that they seemed to move through their days in a state of constant uncertainty, never quite sure what I might do next with the knowledge I possessed. Dave's behavior changed overnight. Gone was the arrogant man who had treated my home like his personal kingdom. In his place was someone who knocked before entering, asked permission before using my telephone, and spoke to me with a politeness that bordered on fearful respect. He began bringing me small gifts, flowers from the grocery store, magazines he thought I might enjoy, boxes of the expensive tea I had mentioned liking once in passing. But I could see the calculation behind his newfound courtesy. This wasn't genuine remorse or respect, it was self-preservation. He was treating me well because he now understood I had the power to destroy his life, not because he had gained any real appreciation for who I was as a person. Dawn's transformation was more complex and painful to watch. My daughter had always been a people pleaser, someone who adapted herself to meet others' expectations rather than standing firm in her own convictions. Now, faced with the reality of what she had done to me and the precarious position it had put her in, she seemed to be wrestling with guilt, fear, and a growing awareness of how much she had changed since marrying Dave. She began visiting me more frequently, but these visits were awkward affairs filled with stilted conversation and careful politeness. She would sit on the edge of the sofa as if ready to flee at any moment, asking about my health and comfort with the mechanical concern of someone following a script. "Are you warm enough, Mom? Do you need anything from the store? How are you sleeping?" I could see her trying to calculate what I wanted to hear, what responses might earn her forgiveness and security. But what she couldn't understand was that I didn't want performance, I wanted authenticity. I wanted my daughter back, not this anxious stranger who had taken her place. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when Dawn arrived with a bouquet of expensive flowers and a confession that revealed just how deep Dave's manipulation had gone. "Mom," she began, settling the flowers in a vase with shaking hands, "I need to tell you something about the last few months, about what really happened between us." I set down my tea and gave her my full attention, sensing that this conversation would be different from the careful exchanges we'd been having. "Dave told me things," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "about your mental state, about incidents that he said proved you weren't safe living alone anymore." "What kind of incidents?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "He said you had called him 3 times in 1 week, confused about what day it was. He said you had left the front door unlocked all night. He said he found you in the grocery store parking lot once, unable to remember where you had parked your car." Each lie felt like a physical blow. I had never called Dave in confusion. In fact, I rarely called him at all. I was meticulous about locking my doors, a habit ingrained by years of living as a widow, and I knew every inch of that grocery store parking lot. I could find my car blindfolded. "None of that happened," I said quietly. Dawn's face crumpled. "I know that now, but at the time he was so convincing. He would tell me these stories with such detail, such concern. He made me feel like I was being negligent by not forcing you to get help." "And you believed him over your own observations." "He made me doubt my own observations," she admitted, tears beginning to flow. "When I would tell him that you seemed fine during my visits, he would say that you were good at hiding your confusion, that people with dementia often had lucid moments. He made me feel like I didn't understand the seriousness of the situation." I could see how it had happened, the slow erosion of Dawn's confidence in her own judgment, the gradual replacement of her perceptions with Dave's version of reality. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation, made more effective by Dawn's genuine love for me and her fear of making the wrong decision. "Why didn't you talk to me directly about these concerns?" I asked. "I tried once," she said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "Do you remember that Sunday in August when I asked if you had been feeling confused lately?" I did remember. Dawn had asked the question so casually that I had barely registered it as significant. When I had assured her that I was feeling perfectly sharp, she had nodded and changed the subject so quickly that I thought she was just making conversation. "Dave said that was proof you weren't aware of your own decline," she continued. "He said people with memory problems often deny having any issues. Every time I tried to evaluate your condition for myself, he had an explanation for why I couldn't trust what I was seeing." The sophistication of Dave's gaslighting took my breath away. He hadn't just lied about my behavior, he had created an entire framework that made it impossible for Dawn to believe anything that contradicted his narrative. He had positioned himself as the only reliable source of information about my condition, making Dawn dependent on his interpretation of reality. "There's more," Dawn said, her voice heavy with shame. "He told me that other people had noticed your decline too. He said Mrs. Henderson from next door had mentioned to him that you seemed confused when she spoke to you. He said the mailman had told him you sometimes forgot to bring in your mail for days at a time." More lies. Mrs. Henderson and I chatted regularly over the garden fence, and she had never expressed any concern about my mental state. As for the mail, I collected it every morning with the same clockwork precision I had maintained for 30 years. "Did you ever verify any of these stories?" I asked. Dawn shook her head miserably. "I should have, but Dave was so certain, so detailed in his accounts. And I was scared, Mom, scared of losing you gradually, scared of making the wrong decision, scared of confronting the possibility that you might really be declining." I could understand her fear. Watching a parent age is one of life's most difficult challenges, filled with ambiguity and agonizing decisions. Dave had exploited that natural anxiety, using Dawn's love for me as a weapon against both of us. "When did you start to suspect he was lying?" I asked. "Honestly, not until I saw those documents in your living room, but looking back now, there were signs I should have noticed. He was always the one bringing up your episodes, always the one insisting we needed to take action. When I would suggest slowing down or getting a second opinion, he would accuse me of being in denial about your condition." Dawn paused, staring out the window at the garden where we had spent so many happy hours together when she was young. He also started making comments about how the house was too much responsibility for you, how you would be happier somewhere with less maintenance and more social activities. But every time I saw you here, you seemed perfectly content. I was content, I confirmed. This house is my sanctuary, filled with memories of your father and our life together. The idea of leaving it felt like dying a little bit. "I know that now," she whispered. "But Dave convinced me that your attachment to the house was unhealthy, that you were living in the past instead of embracing the future. He made it sound like we would be doing you a favor by forcing you to move." The cruelest part of Dave's manipulation was how he had twisted Dawn's genuine concern for my well-being into a tool for achieving his own goals. He had taken her love and used it to hurt both of us, fracturing our relationship while positioning himself as the hero trying to help a family in crisis. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Dawn looked at me with eyes full of pain and regret. "Because I finally understand what he did to both of us. Because I need you to know that the daughter who said those terrible things to you, who tried to take your home away, that wasn't really me. That was me filtered through his lies and manipulation." "But you still said those things," I pointed out gently. "You still packed up my memories like they were worthless. You still took my mother's jewelry." "I know," she said, fresh tears flowing, "and I will regret those actions for the rest of my life. I can't undo the pain I caused you, but I can try to make sure it never happens again." As the weeks passed and the shock of my financial revelations settled into a new normal, I began to see signs of genuine change in both Dawn and Dave, though their transformations took very different paths. Dave's evolution was purely strategic. He had calculated the new balance of power and adjusted his behavior accordingly, but there was no real growth or understanding behind his actions. He treated me with the careful respect one might show a dangerous animal, polite, cautious, but fundamentally unchanged in his core beliefs about who I was and what I deserved. His attempts at manipulation became more sophisticated but no less transparent. He would bring up Dawn's pregnancy frequently, suggesting that stress over our family disagreement might be harmful to the baby. He would mention financial pressures they were facing, hinting that a small loan from my newfound wealth would solve all their problems. He would even, in moments of particular desperation, suggest that he had learned valuable lessons from our conflict and was grateful for the opportunity to become a better man. But I could see through his performance because I had learned to watch his eyes. They remained cold and calculating, measuring my responses for weakness, looking for angles he could exploit. Dave hadn't changed, he had simply become more careful about revealing his true nature. Dawn's journey was more genuine, but also more painful to witness. She was like someone waking up from a years-long dream, slowly recognizing how much of her identity had been shaped by Dave's influence. The process was clearly agonizing for her as she confronted the gap between who she had been before marriage and who she had become. She began questioning other aspects of their relationship that she had previously accepted without thought. Why had Dave insisted she quit her job after their wedding? Why did he control their finances so completely that she needed permission to buy anything beyond groceries? Why had he gradually cut her off from friends who didn't understand their relationship? One evening, as we sat together in my living room, a scene that would have been impossible just months before, Dawn asked me a question that broke my heart with its innocence. "Mom, was I happy before I married Dave?" The question revealed how thoroughly her husband had rewritten her personal history. She genuinely couldn't remember what her own emotional state had been before his influence took hold. "You were radiant," I told her honestly. "You laughed easily, had opinions about everything, made decisions quickly and confidently. You were studying to be a teacher, remember? You used to tell me about the classroom you would set up, the lessons you wanted to teach, the difference you were going to make in children's lives." Dawn stared at her hands, tears dropping onto her wedding ring. I had forgotten about teaching. Dave said it was impractical, that the pay was too low and the stress too high. He convinced me that being a wife and mother would be more fulfilling. And has it been fulfilling? She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. I've been so focused on being what Dave wanted me to be that I lost track of what I wanted for myself." This was the conversation I had been hoping for, not the strategic politeness of her recent visits, but genuine reflection on the choices that had led us to this point. For the first time since her marriage, I felt like I was talking to my actual daughter rather than the woman Dave had molded her into. "What do you want now?" I asked gently. "I want my baby to know their grandmother," she said immediately. "I want to raise them in a house filled with love instead of manipulation. I want to remember who I was before I became so afraid of making the wrong choice that I stopped making any choices at all." That conversation marked the beginning of Dawn's real transformation. Over the following weeks, she began reclaiming small pieces of her identity. She started reading again, something she had abandoned because Dave complained that her books were a waste of time. She began expressing opinions during our conversations instead of waiting to see what I thought before committing to a position. She even mentioned the possibility of returning to school to finish her teaching degree once the baby was older. But the most significant change was in how she interacted with Dave. I witnessed several conversations where she pushed back against his attempts to make decisions for her, insisting on having input into choices about their life together. These confrontations were clearly difficult for her. She had been trained to defer to his judgment for so long that asserting her own will felt unnatural and frightening. Dave didn't handle this shift well. He had married a compliant woman who validated his sense of superiority and control. This new version of Dawn, who asked questions and expressed preferences, was not what he had signed up for. His frustration began showing in small ways: sharp comments about her newfound attitude, complaints about her spending too much time with me, suggestions that pregnancy hormones were making her emotional and irrational. The final confrontation came on a cold February morning when Dave arrived at my house unannounced, his face red with anger and his usual careful politeness completely abandoned. "This has gone far enough," he announced, storming into my living room without invitation. "You've turned my wife against me, filled her head with ideas about independence and self-worth. You're destroying my marriage." I looked up from the book I was reading, keeping my voice calm and level. "I haven't destroyed anything, Dave. I've simply shown Don what respect looks like." "Respect," he laughed bitterly. "You call this respect? Using your money to manipulate us, threatening our security, turning Dawn into someone I don't even recognize." "The Dawn you don't recognize is the woman she was before you changed her," I replied. "And if you can't love that version of her, then maybe you never loved her at all." Dawn emerged from the kitchen where she had been making tea, her face pale but determined. "Dave, what are you doing here?" "I'm trying to save our marriage," he said, turning to her with the pleading expression he had perfected over years of manipulation. "Your mother has poisoned you against me. Can't you see what she's doing?" "What I see," Dawn said quietly, "is my husband yelling at my mother in her own home. What I see is the man who supposedly loves me trying to isolate me from the only family I have left." Dave's face darkened. "I'm your family now. I'm your husband, the father of your child. That should matter more than some old woman who hid her wealth from you for years." The insult hung in the air like a slap. Dawn's face went white, then red with anger I hadn't seen from her in years. "Don't you ever speak about my mother that way again," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "She didn't hide anything from me. She didn't know about it herself. But you've been lying to me for months, making me believe she was sick, convincing me to betray the woman who sacrificed everything for my happiness." "Dawn, you're being emotional." "I'm being honest," she interrupted, and I felt a surge of pride at her strength. "For the first time in years, I'm being completely honest. You lied about my mother's condition. You manipulated me into hurting her. You tried to steal her house. And now you're standing in her living room, insulting her and demanding that I choose between my husband and my mother." Dave's face went through a range of expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally, cold determination. "Fine," he said. "If that's how you want to play this, then yes, you do have to choose. It's me or her, Dawn, your marriage or your mother." The silence that followed was absolute. This was the moment I had been dreading and hoping for simultaneously, the moment when Dawn would have to decide who she really was and what kind of life she wanted to live. Dawn looked at him for a long moment, and I could see years of conditioning warring with newly rediscovered strength. Then she straightened her shoulders, placed her hands protectively over her pregnant belly, and spoke words that changed everything. "Then I choose her. The trial." The months that followed Dawn's decision were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering, emotional upheaval, and gradual healing. Dave, true to his vindictive nature, had filed for divorce immediately and demanded full custody of their unborn child, claiming that Dawn was mentally unstable and I was a dangerous influence on the family. His lawsuit painted me as a manipulative woman who had used hidden wealth to destroy a happy marriage, and Dawn as a victim of my psychological abuse who was unfit to raise a child. The irony of his accusations would have been laughable if the stakes hadn't been so high. Here was a man who had spent years systematically manipulating and controlling my daughter, now claiming that she was the victim of manipulation by someone else. Dawn moved back into her childhood bedroom, and slowly, day by day, I began to see glimpses of the young woman I remembered. Pregnancy suited her in ways that had nothing to do with the physical changes. There was a new determination in her eyes, a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. She was no longer making decisions based on what others expected of her. She was making choices based on what she believed was right for her child. The legal proceedings were brutal. Dave's lawyer painted a picture of a confused, elderly woman who had suddenly discovered wealth and was using it to manipulate her daughter's marriage. They suggested that my years of modest living proved I was either mentally incompetent or deliberately deceptive. They brought in witnesses who testified about my odd behavior, the mailman who claimed I sometimes seemed confused, neighbors who said I had become reclusive after my husband's death. Of course, every single witness was either lying or had been misled by Dave, but proving that in court was more challenging than I had anticipated. Dave had spent months preparing for this battle, creating a narrative that painted him as the victim and me as the villain. Our lawyer, Victoria Chen, was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in family law and elder abuse cases. She had taken our case after reviewing the evidence and becoming convinced that Dave's actions constituted a clear pattern of financial abuse and manipulation, but even she warned us that the outcome was far from certain. Judges see a lot of family disputes, she explained during one of our preparation sessions. Sometimes they become cynical about motivations on all sides. We need to be prepared for the possibility that the court might view this as a typical family money dispute rather than a case of abuse and manipulation. The night before the trial, I barely slept. Dawn, now 7 months pregnant and glowing with health despite the stress, sat with me in the living room where this had all began. "Are you nervous?" she asked, rubbing her belly absently. "Terrified," I admitted. Not of losing the money, that was never what this was about, but terrified of losing you and the baby to someone who doesn't understand what love really means. Dawn took my hand, her fingers strong and warm. "That's not going to happen," she said with quiet confidence. "Whatever the judge decides about custody or money, you're not losing me again. I won't let anyone come between us like that ever again." The morning of the trial dawned gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones. I dressed in my best black suit, the same one I had worn to my husband's funeral, now pressed into service for another kind of ending. Dawn wore a navy maternity dress that emphasized her pregnancy, and we walked into the courthouse together, our hands linked like we were facing a storm. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh relief. Dave sat at the plaintiff's table with his expensive lawyer, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than I used to spend on clothes in a year. He looked confident, even smug, as if the outcome was already decided in his favor. As the proceedings began, I listened to Dave's lawyer present their case with growing disbelief at the audacity of their lies. According to their version of events, I was a mentally unstable woman who had hidden assets from my own family, then used the discovery of those assets to destroy my daughter's marriage out of jealousy and spite. Dawn was portrayed as a victim of my manipulation, a confused young woman who had been turned against her loving husband by a bitter old woman who couldn't accept that her daughter had grown up and moved on. They brought witnesses who testified about my erratic behavior and declining mental state. The mailman, coached by Dave's lawyer, claimed I had seemed confused during several interactions, sometimes forgetting conversations we had supposedly had days before. A neighbor testified that I had become increasingly reclusive and suspicious after my husband's death, avoiding social contact and making bizarre accusations about Dave's character. Every word felt like a knife, not because the accusations were true, but because they revealed how thoroughly Dave had poisoned my reputation in preparation for this moment. He had spent months planting seeds of doubt about my mental state, creating a narrative that would support his legal strategy. When it was our turn to present our case, Victoria methodically dismantled their lies with documentation and evidence. She presented the timeline of my husband's investments, showing that the wealth hadn't been hidden, but rather carefully built over decades through legitimate means. She showed bank records proving that I had been living on a modest pension not because I was poor, but because I had been unaware of the other accounts my husband had established. Most damaging to Dave's case were the recordings Dawn had secretly made during their final weeks together, conversations where he clearly manipulated her emotions and admitted to lying about my supposed decline. In one particularly devastating exchange, he could be heard coaching her on what to say to social services about my mental state, suggesting specific incidents that had never actually occurred. But the moment that changed everything came when Judge Morales looked up from the evidence and recognized me. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous. 30 years fell away in an instant, and I saw not the distinguished judge in his black robes, but the young law clerk who had worked in my office when I was a secretary at the family court. David Morales had been a shy, insecure young man who had doubted his abilities and struggled with the confidence needed to succeed in law. I had encouraged him, brought him coffee during late nights, helped him organize files and understand court procedures. "Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Maeve Williams from Judge Patterson's office." The entire courtroom fell silent. Dave's face went pale as he realized that this unexpected connection might change everything. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice barely steady. "I remember you, David. You used to work late every night, studying case law and practicing your arguments." Judge Morales smiled, and for a moment, his professional composure slipped to reveal the warm gratitude of someone remembering kindness from decades past. "You were the only person in that office who believed I could actually become a lawyer. When everyone else treated me like I was just the coffee boy, you encouraged me to keep studying, keep trying." "I always knew you'd make an excellent judge," I said, meaning every word. The impact of this exchange on the courtroom was immediate and dramatic. Dave's lawyer tried to object, claiming conflict of interest, but Judge Morales handled the situation with perfect professionalism. "There is no conflict of interest," he stated firmly. "I will judge this case based on the evidence presented, just as I would any other case. However, I will note for the record that Mrs. Williams's character, as I observed it 30 years ago, was impeccable." What followed was a methodical destruction of Dave's case. Judge Morales had clearly been affected by the recognition, but his judgment was based on the evidence, not on sentiment. The recordings Don had made were particularly damaging, revealing Dave's manipulation in his own words. His attempts to claim that I had hidden assets were proven false by the timeline Victoria presented. His accusations about my mental state were contradicted by medical records and witness testimony from people who actually knew me well. But perhaps most damaging was Dave himself. Under cross-examination, his mask of respectability slipped completely. When pressed about his accusations, he became defensive and hostile. When confronted with evidence of his lies, he became evasive and aggressive. The man who had presented himself as a concerned husband protecting his family was revealed as someone driven by greed and vindictiveness. The verdict was swift and comprehensive. Dave lost all claims to custody of the unborn child and was ordered to pay substantial damages for his attempted financial abuse. The judge's closing statement made his opinion of Dave's character crystal clear. "This court finds that Mr. Foster engaged in a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation and attempted financial abuse. His actions demonstrate a pattern of behavior that is fundamentally incompatible with the responsibilities of parenthood. Mrs. Williams, meanwhile, has shown remarkable restraint and wisdom in how she has handled this situation. Her use of her resources to protect herself and her daughter, rather than to seek revenge, speaks to a character that this court respects deeply." As we left the courthouse that day, Dawn pregnant and glowing with relief, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete peace. Justice had been served, but more importantly, my family had been restored. In the months that followed the trial, our lives settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. Dawn bloomed during the final months of her pregnancy, freed from the constant stress of Dave's manipulation and secure in the knowledge that her child would grow up in an environment of love and respect rather than control and fear. We spent long evenings in the garden, tending to the vegetables my husband had once planted and planning improvements for the baby's arrival. Dawn had decided to convert her old childhood bedroom into a nursery, and we spent happy hours choosing paint, colors, and furniture, discussing the kind of childhood we wanted to provide for this new life that would soon join our family. The transformation in Dawn was remarkable to witness. Day by day, I watched her rediscover parts of herself that had been buried during her marriage. She began reading voraciously again, devouring novels and parenting books with equal enthusiasm. She started expressing opinions on everything from politics to decorating, often surprising herself with the strength of her convictions. Most importantly, she began making plans for her future that extended beyond simply being someone's wife or mother. "I want to go back to school," she told me one afternoon as we folded tiny baby clothes, her hands gentle on the soft cotton onesies. "I want to finish my teaching degree. I know it will be challenging with the baby, but I feel like I need to do something meaningful with my life." "Your father would be so proud," I said, remembering how excited he had been about Dawn's original plans to become a teacher. "He always said you had the patience and wisdom to shape young minds." The baby arrived on a warm day in May, a healthy girl with Dawn's dark eyes and what I swore was my late husband's determined chin. We named her Hope, a name that felt appropriate given everything we had been through to reach this moment of joy. Holding my granddaughter for the first time, feeling the weight of new life in my arms, I understood that all the pain and struggle of the previous year had led to this moment. Hope would grow up knowing she was wanted and loved, surrounded by women who had fought to protect her before she was even born. Dawn proved to be a natural mother, confident and intuitive in ways that would have surprised the uncertain woman she had been during her marriage. But then, she was no longer that woman. The trials of the past year had forged her into someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't allow anyone to diminish it. 3 months after Hope's birth, Dawn started her first college class in over 5 years. She arranged her schedule around the baby's needs, studying during naps and late at night after Hope was asleep. I helped as much as I could, delighting in my role as grandmother and caregiver, finally understanding what my husband had envisioned when he had structured his will to protect our family's future. The money, our money, became a tool for building the life we wanted rather than simply accumulating wealth. We used it to make the house more comfortable and safe for the baby, to pay for Dawn's education, and to establish a college fund for Hope that would ensure she never had to choose between her dreams and financial security. But perhaps more importantly, we used some of the resources to help other women who found themselves in situations similar to what we had experienced. Dawn's idea initially was to start a support group for women dealing with manipulative relationships. It grew from there into something more comprehensive, a foundation that provided legal aid, counseling, and temporary housing for women trying to escape controlling situations. "So many women don't have what we had," Dawn said during one of our planning sessions. "They don't have financial resources or family support. They're completely isolated and convinced they have no choices." The Restoration Foundation, as we named it, became Dawn's passion project. She threw herself into the work with the same determination she had once applied to being the perfect wife, but now her energy was directed toward helping others rather than pleasing someone who would never be satisfied. We helped women who had been financially abused by spouses who controlled every dollar. We assisted elderly parents who were being manipulated by adult children seeking early inheritances. We provided resources for young women who were isolated from friends and family by controlling partners. Each case was heartbreaking in its own way, but also inspiring. These women, given support and resources, showed remarkable strength and resilience. They left abusive situations, rebuilt their lives, found their voices again. Some went back to school, others started businesses. Many simply discovered that they were capable of far more than they had been allowed to believe. Dawn's work with the foundation also helped her process her own experience. She became skilled at recognizing the patterns of manipulation and control, the gradual erosion of self-confidence that makes victims doubt their own perceptions. She developed an almost intuitive ability to help women untangle the lies they had been told from the truth of their own worth. "I understand how it happens," she would tell the women we helped. "I understand how someone who loves you can convince you that they know what's best for you better than you do. I understand how isolation feels like protection and how control feels like care. But I also understand that you are stronger than you know and that you deserve so much more than you've been settling for." Judge Morales, who had become something of a family friend after the trial, often referred cases to our foundation. His recognition of me in the courtroom had been a turning point not just in our legal battle, but in his own understanding of how abuse can hide behind respectability and concern. "Your case opened my eyes," he told me during one of his visits to see Hope. "I've been more careful since then about looking beyond the surface presentation of family disputes. Too many times, the person who seems most reasonable and articulate is actually the one doing the most damage." As Hope grew from infant to toddler, our house filled with the sounds of childhood again: laughter, crying, the patter of small feet on hardwood floors. Dawn proved to be not just a devoted mother but a thoughtful one, raising her daughter with clear boundaries and abundant love, teaching her early that her voice mattered and her choices were her own. "I want her to grow up knowing she has power," Dawn said one afternoon as we watched Hope play in the garden where I had once tended my violets alone. "Not power over other people, but power over her own life. I want her to understand that love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller." Dave, meanwhile, had largely disappeared from our lives. We heard through mutual acquaintances that he had moved to another state, married again quickly, and was reportedly having difficulties in his new relationship. I felt no satisfaction in his struggles. By then, I had moved beyond anger or desire for revenge. He had simply become irrelevant to our happiness. "Do you ever regret how things ended?" Dawn asked me once. "I regret that it took so long for both of us to see the truth," I replied. "But I don't regret standing up for myself or for you. Some battles are worth fighting, even when the cost is high." On Hope's second birthday, as we celebrated in the garden with cake and balloons and the kind of simple joy that had been missing from our lives for too long, I thought about my husband's letter and his hope that I would use the power he had given me wisely. I had used it to protect myself, to educate my daughter, and to help other women find their own strength. I had used it not for revenge, but for restoration. Looking at Hope, now a confident toddler with her mother's determination and her grandfather's stubborn streak, I knew that the legacy we were building was exactly what he had envisioned. This little girl would grow up knowing that she was valued for who she was, not for what she could do for others. She would learn early that love and respect go hand in hand, that real strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Dawn, now in her final year of her teaching degree and preparing to start her career, had become the woman I always knew she could be: strong, independent, compassionate, and wise. She had learned that true love doesn't require you to lose yourself, that the right person will celebrate your strength rather than try to diminish it. As for me, at 71, I had discovered that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to reclaim your dignity, never too late to use whatever power you have to make the world a little bit better. The scared, lonely woman who had nearly signed away her home and her independence had evolved into someone who understood her own worth and wasn't afraid to defend it. That evening, after Hope was tucked into bed and Dawn was studying at the kitchen table where she had once done her childhood homework, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, watching the African violets bloom in the fading light. My husband's presence felt strong in that moment, as if he were sitting beside me, proud of what we had built with the foundation he had provided. The house was full of life again, with Dawn's laughter and Hope's chatter and the constant stream of visitors who came for foundation meetings or simply to visit. It was exactly the kind of home my husband had envisioned when he made his careful investments and wrote his protective will. I had learned that money, in the end, is just a tool. It can be used to control or to liberate, to harm or to heal, to isolate or to connect. What matters is the heart behind the power, the intention that guides the choices. We had chosen love over fear, restoration over revenge, hope over bitterness. And in making those choices, we had not just reclaimed our own lives, we had created something larger than ourselves, a legacy that would outlast all of us. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I smiled, feeling my husband's love surrounding me like a warm embrace, knowing that the best was yet to come. This story of resilience, family bonds, and the quiet power of standing up for oneself reminds us that strength comes not from wealth or position, but from knowing our own worth and refusing to let others diminish it. Sometimes the greatest victories are not won through force, but through the patient application of truth, love, and unwavering dignity.